Well, welcome to episode 418 of 10-Minute Record Reviews, and this time I'm delighted to be talking about this record, Eastward Ho, Harold Land in New York. Harold Land makes this with the trumpeter Kenny Dorham. For Jazzland Records, it's recorded in 1960 and it comes out in 1961. I have in 1961 first mono press, which sounds pretty darn good. Sometimes Jazzland Records can have a little bit of surface noise because it was a budget label, but don't let that deter you. The music is excellent. Harold Land is, as many have observed, one of the most East Coast of West Coast musicians. His reputation as a tenor player has grown in recent decades, I think, to be fairly mentioned along some of the more celebrated tenors of the classic period of modern jazz, people like Sonny Rollins or Hank Mobley. This record pairs him with a giant of hard bop trumpet, Kenny Dorham. Currently, it's my favorite record. It's not far from my turntable at any particular point. It is made in the immediate aftermath of one of the most remarkable moral panics in jazz history. It's brilliant all the way through, and it deserves your exploration. About a year ago, I devoted a video to a record made by Harold Land called West Coast Blues, which was made just 6 weeks before this record. Now, often when I'm discussing a record made by an artist whom I've already discussed in this channel, I'll spend some of the time talking about, the artist's evolution between the two records. In this case, it's just a month and a half. But the way in which Harold ends up in New York to make this record with a fundamentally different cast of characters that he'd made the celebrated West Coast Blues is kind of interesting. This record, like West Coast Blues, is also made for Jazzland, but its making has somewhat less to do with the label than it has to do with two trumpeters, Kenny Dorham and Shorty Rogers, and an outbreak of senseless violence. Kenny Dorham and Harold Land were both Texas-born musicians. They pursued their careers on different coasts, but they had a lot in common musically, and they managed to connect quite a few times. Dorham, of course, was one of the original jazz messengers, and on leaving that group, he then records widely for Blue Note and Prestige and Riverside, and is basically a top-tier first-call trumpeter on the New York jazz scene in the late 1950s. Out on the other coast, Land was the only musician who belonged to both of the two finest hard bop groups that ever formed in Los Angeles, the Brown Roach Quintet and the group led by Curtis Counts, and both those groups could match anything that Miles or Art Blakey or Horace Silver were serving up at the time. It was while Harold was playing with Brown and Roach in 1954 and 1955 that he first meets Kenny Dorham, who would sit in regularly when that quintet came to New York. A year or two later, in the spring of 1957, Dorham comes out to Los Angeles, and he ends up doing some work with both Max Roach and with Harold Land. He makes two records, one with Roach for Emercy Records, Jazz in 3/4 Time. For the other record, Dorham hooks up with Harold Land in his own network of West Coast musicians, people like Lou Levy and Lawrence Marable and Herb Geller, and those musicians, along with the bassist Ray Brown, make Herb Geller's Fire in the West for Jubilee, which is a fantastic record. That, however, was it for Kenny Dorham's LA forays. For the rest of the 1950s, he was basically a fixture in New York, other than a brief period in 1959 in the spring when he goes to Paris and makes records with Barney Whelan. He was usually to be found playing in Manhattan clubs or New York area studios. After leaving Brown and Roach of his own accord in 1955, Harold Land spends the next few years in the superb Curtis Counts Quintet. His bandmates in that group, Curtis Counts on bass, Jack Sheldon on trumpet, Carl Perkins on piano, and the drummer Frank Butler, all made records as leaders in their own right and are all, I would say, under-heralded. That band, of course, after putting out 3 wonderful records, comes to an end when Perkins dies of an overdose at 29. The band is devastated, they break apart, but Harold Land really is in his prime at this point. He records widely for West Coast labels in the latter part of the 1950s and early 60s, including records for Contemporary, for Pacific Jazz, and a number of records for the small West Coast label Hi-Fi Jazz. He also did some work at the end of the decade with the trumpeter Shorty Rogers. Now, Rogers at the time, in 1959-60, was working on a record which some consider to be the album that killed his career, or at least killed RCA's faith in him, The Swingin' Nutcracker. This was an ambitious jazz reworking of the Nutcracker Suite using a 22-man orchestra, a record which managed to repel fans of ballet and classical music while still managing to alienate jazz fans for being too kitschy. It's also a bit cursed. It ended up coming out at the same time as Duke Ellington's treatment of the Nutcracker Suite. Duke sold, Shorty's didn't, despite the fact that Shorty's record was actually not too bad. Anyway, this whole Christmas tangent only matters because Shorty had asked Harold Land to be part of a 5-man saxophone quintet, which was part of this Nutcracker orchestra. After the Nutcracker recordings finished in May, Shorty had a booking to play at the beginning of July at the Newport Jazz Festival in Rhode Island on July the 3rd. He asked Harold Land and Land's regular performing quartet to come along with him to make a quintet at the festival. But Newport 1960 was not like other versions of Newport. I have a theory, which will probably become a video at some point, that Newport 1960 explains the history of jazz in lots of interesting and novel ways, but I don't have time to get into that right now. That year, maybe there was a bad aura leading Charles Mingus and Max Roach to call the festival a Jim Crow event and set up their own rebel festival. Maybe it was a decision by the festival, also criticized by Mingus, to include a number of non-jazz acts like the Kingston Trio in an effort to diversify and attract attendance, and that leads to a very large and very inebriated crowd of college kids, ticketless, but attending the festival. Or maybe it was just one of those things that was ordained, marking the end of the 1950s and the beginning of the 1960s, because on the Saturday night, it kicked off in a potent mixture of beer, violence, public nudity, and tear gas marked the end of the festival, at least until 1962. The upshot, of course, is that Rogers and his quintet, who were booked for the Sunday night, never played, and in the aftermath, Land and Orrin Keepnews of Riverside Records reached out to Kenny Dorham, and those two great musicians, along with Land's backing group, go into the studio 2 days later to make this record. This record is made in New York City at Plaza Sound Studios on July 5th and July 8th, 1960. Orrin Keepnews is the producer and Ray Fowler is the engineer. Harold Land plays tenor, Kenny Dorham plays trumpet, and the rhythm section is comprised of Amos Trice on piano, Clarence Jones on bass, and Joe Peters on drums. Who, you may be saying? Well, indeed. Trice and Jones and Peters were the three musicians who regularly filled out Land's performing quartet, according to the liner notes on here. And recall, of course, that the reason that Land had come to New York in the first place was with Shorty originally to play at Newport. And the quintet at Newport was likely to be the lineup on this record, but with Shorty Rogers instead of Kenny Dorham on trumpet. Joe Peters, who's a bit of an enigma to research, I will say, was in his final weeks with the group. He's on this record, but then 17 days later, Land makes a record in LA called Take Aim. Trice and Jones are on that record, but Peters is gone and Leon Pettis is in the drum chair. Assuming that Orrin Keepnews is not fibbing in the liner notes, the subsequent lineup on Take Aim means that Peters has basically shown the door between this record and 17 days later out in LA, or he decides to stay in New York and not go back out to the West Coast. He was, of course, from Buffalo. Side 1 starts with the standard So in Love by Cole Porter, and so much of what's good about this record is on this track. Land and Dorham are so complementary. Land has nothing to fear, you feel, when you hear this, from comparisons to people like Junior Cook or Hank Mobley, those other East Coast tenors of the time. He's one of the great lyrical tenors, and Amos Trice has this knack for very simple, quite unique, swinging piano lines. He's kind of like the love child of Ahmad Jamal and Horace Silver, and the bass, too, is gloriously high in the mix, which I love. Triple Trouble is an original by Amos Trice. My previous comments about bass and piano refer. It's superb. And Slowly, which appropriately starts off as the slowest track on the record, then breaks into double time as a foundation for two of the longer horn solos. Side 2 is, in my opinion, just fantastic. It starts with On a Little Street in Singapore, which starts at a fast pace, but Land's buttery tone somehow seems to make this whole track seem relaxed, even when the band is shifting into something like 300 beats a minute double time. And the pièce de résistance is the last track, OK Blues, dedicated to Orrin Keepnews on a record of killer tracks. This is the killer track. It's full of delicious soloing by Land and Dorham, but my favorite part is Clarence Jones' walking bass line, beautifully highlighted by the engineering. As I mentioned at the outset, this record is currently inseparable from my turntable. All 5 tracks are burners, and the production, while perhaps not perfect or necessarily to everybody's taste, for me anyway, has a very tasty focus on the bass. Dorham is his usual self. Land at this point is going from strength to strength. The rhythm section is excellent, and not only am I blown away by this record, I'm also now on a hunt to find pretty much everything that Land recorded in that period in the late 1950s and early 1960s. If you find this record, which is not necessarily that easy to do, I encourage you to seize it if it's anything like a reasonable price, and for me, it's 4.5 out of 5 stars.